What if the world map you were shown since childhood was incomplete? What if there are not 7 continents, but 8, and one of them has been lying underwater all this time, right in front of us? It was not lost. It was not invented. It was simply not called what it may have truly been for far too long. New Zealand. For some, it is a beautiful group of islands at the edge of the Pacific Ocean. For others, it may be the visible peak of something much larger, older, and far more inconvenient. But why was this discussed so late? Why did old maps seem to hint at southern lands before the official dates? And why does every new trace open not an answer, but a more dangerous question? Who really knew about these shores before the famous names from the textbooks? What did the caves hide for centuries, untouched by human eyes? Why do ancient traditions suddenly sound less like fairy tales and more like warnings? And what kind of discovery made researchers look at New Zealand's past as if something there simply did not add up? Watch this video until the end, because this will not be a calm lecture or schoolbook geography. There will be strange maps, traces of vanished giants, disturbing cave finds, and one question that cannot be brushed aside: what else lies beneath Zealandia, and why were we shown only the peak for so long? New Zealand is not the edge of the world. It is a deceptively small signboard standing at the entrance to a drowned continent. On a school map, those 2 islands look modest, almost accidental, as if someone simply dropped them into the Pacific Ocean between Australia and Antarctica. But beneath the water lies a completely different body of the planet, a massive structure covering about 4.9 million square kilometers. This refers to Zealandia, a continent that sank almost entirely beneath the ocean, leaving only its highest points above the surface. The North Island, the South Island, a few smaller pieces of land. Everything else lies under the weight of the ocean at depths of roughly 1,000 to 2,000 meters. And here comes the uncomfortable detail. New Zealand is not an island country in the usual sense. It is the visible crown of an ancient world that once had mountains, plains, fractures, its own nature, and its own long geological fate. Then that world slipped downward as if it had been slowly drowned, together with all its traces. Beneath nearly a mile of water lie not empty stones. There are ridges that could compete with the Alps. There are plains whose scale could rival large regions of Europe. There is an enormous underwater landmass that for centuries was not called a continent, even though it remained exactly where it was and never truly disappeared. This refers not to a pretty legend and not to a tourist fairy tale. It refers to the map of the planet itself. People looked at New Zealand and saw 2 islands, but underneath them lay almost the entire missing part of the picture. A continent hidden not in myth, but in water. And if New Zealand is only the summit, then the question becomes sharper. What exactly went underwater with the rest of Zealandia? Only rock? Only ancient plains? Or, beneath the dark weight of the Pacific Ocean, is there a far more inconvenient story? One that the familiar school map simply cannot explain. 2017, geologists finally said out loud what had been hanging over the world map for decades like an inconvenient accusation. Beneath the Pacific Ocean, east of Australia, there was not just a broken piece of Earth's crust, not some random underwater plate, not a minor detail for specialists. There was a continent. And here comes the question that makes the school map look painfully poor. Why was this called a discovery only when the enormous Zealandia had already been lying in its place for millions of years? Why did a landmass almost half the size of Australia remain, in the public mind, as something underwater, as if reality itself depended on whether people agreed to name it? This refers to the recognition of Zealandia in 2017. Not a fairy tale, not a mystical atlas, not a fabricated land from old sea stories. It was scientists, geologists, experts in Earth's crust and ocean floors who said it. This structure fits the main criteria of a separate continent. Picture a dry scientific hall, not a temple of sensation, not a studio with blazing lights, not a place where people shout loud claims for applause. Maps, reports, diagrams, cold lighting, and faces of people trained to speak not in emotions, but in rock layers, crust thickness, and millions of years. Then a giant shape appears on the screen. 4.9 million square kilometers, larger than India, almost half the size of Australia. And above the water, only the visible scraps, the North Island, the South Island, and a handful of smaller pieces of land that the world is used to calling New Zealand. This refers to the most uncomfortable detail. In 2017, Zealandia was not created. It was not invented. It was not pulled out of fantasy. It was recognized. And between discovered and recognized, there is a dangerous gap, because you can only recognize something that already existed and waited too long to be named. The phrase sounds almost defiant. We found a continent. But did they really find it only then? Or did they simply stop pretending that what lay under the water was secondary, minor, and harmless? That is the sting of this story. Sometimes a map does not lie directly. It simply keeps silent about the most important thing. Zealandia struck the familiar geographical picture like a hammer. The planet turned out to be less neatly arranged than a school textbook suggests. A whole continent could exist nearby, with borders, crust, structure, and an ancient history, and still remain almost invisible to the mass imagination. This refers not only to geology, it refers to how official memory works. Until something is named, it is treated as if it barely exists. While specialists argue over terms, millions of people continue carrying a simplified map in their heads. And beneath that map lies another world, vast, drowned, and inconvenient. That is why the recognition of Zealandia was not just another scientific note. It was a loud snap against human self-confidence. A continent that did not fit the old-school formula suddenly received the right to be called by its proper name. And after that, the question can no longer be pushed back under the water. If one continent could remain in the shadows for so long, what else do we dismiss as a minor detail simply because it is more convenient that way? Here is why Zealandia is not a pretty geographical curiosity and not a journalist's toy for loud headlines. It has size, it has a body, it has borders, and the most unpleasant thing for skeptics, it has the signs of a continent that cannot simply be erased from the map. Zealandia covers about 4.9 million square kilometers. That is larger than India. That is almost half the size of Australia. Not a tiny underwater bump, not a random fragment of the seabed, but a giant structure whose scale can compete with entire states and continental masses. This refers to the first blow against the familiar version. If an object larger than India lies under the ocean, it becomes difficult to call it an insignificant detail. You can argue over terms, hide behind scientific wording, pretend that water cancels everything. But water does not cancel geology. Most of Zealandia is indeed hidden below the surface. The depth is roughly from 1,000 to 2,000 meters. Above the water remain only the North Island, the South Island, and a few smaller pieces of land. Everything else is an enormous underwater country, as if deliberately removed from the sight of an ordinary person. But a continent is not defined only by whether it sticks out above the water. Otherwise, half of Earth's geological history would have to be rewritten according to sea level. A continent is defined by crustal structure, elevation above the ocean floor, rock composition, thickness and boundaries. And this is where Zealandia stops speaking the language of sensation and starts speaking the language of hard facts. This refers to 4 key signs. First, Zealandia stands higher than the surrounding ocean floor. Second, it has a characteristic continental geology, not ordinary oceanic crust. Third, Its crust is noticeably thicker than typical oceanic crust. Fourth, it has clear boundaries separating it from neighboring structures. This combination is what makes the story of Zealandia so inconvenient. Each feature on its own could be explained, debated, pushed aside. But when everything comes together, area, crust, elevation, borders, origin, we are no longer looking at an accident. We are looking at a continent that was denied full status for far too long. The boundary with Australia does not exist only in the imagination of mapmakers. It is connected with real geological structures, including the region of the Tasman Sea and underwater ridges. On one side lies the Australian mass, on the other, Zealandia. Two different worlds that were once part of a vast ancient system and then pulled apart like cracked plates under the pressure of time. This refers not to a myth about a lost land, but to the cold anatomy of the planet. Zealandia has a skeleton. It has a shape. It has a history. And if only a small part is visible above the water, that does not mean the rest does not exist. Here is the main strike against schoolbook simplicity. We are used to calling a continent only what we can walk on with our feet. But Zealandia shows another reality. A continent can be almost completely hidden, can lie under the dark weight of water, can remain invisible to the public mind for centuries, and still be real. And then the question becomes even more dangerous. If an entire continent could hide in plain sight for so long, covered by ocean and textbook indifference, how many other invisible pages lie in the history of the Earth? And how many times have we been shown only the peaks and told that this was the whole picture? Zealandia was not always hiding beneath the ocean. It was not always a dark patch on geological diagrams, and it did not look like some mysterious fragment at the edge of the map. Around 85 million years ago, it was part of Gondwana, the giant ancient supercontinent from which Australia, Antarctica, South America, Africa, and other landmasses later broke away. And this is where the brutal mechanics of geology begin. The Earth did not split neatly and beautifully like a schoolbook illustration. It cracked, stretched, and pulled apart under pressure from deep forces, and Zealandia ended up in a zone where the continental crust began to thin. Not vanish at once, not collapse in a single blow, but slowly lose height millions of years in a row. This refers to the very nature of a drowned continent. Zealandia did not fall to the bottom of the ocean in one day, and it was not the victim of one sudden catastrophe. It was pushed downward by time, crustal stretching, and gravity. The planet worked without pity, without pauses, and without witnesses. Around 80 million years ago, a significant part of Zealandia was still above sea level. It was not a small archipelago, but a vast, warm, humid landmass in the southern Pacific. There could have been mountain ranges, lowlands, rivers, forests, closed valleys, and its own separate life, cut off from the future continents. Then the slow sinking began. The continental crust stretched, became thinner, lost stability, and enormous areas of land dropped lower and lower. By around 25 million years ago, most of Zealandia was already underwater. Only the highest sections remained above the surface, the future islands of New Zealand. This refers not to a romantic legend about a lost land, but to a cold geological drama. There was a great landmass, then it sank lower. Then the ocean took the valleys, the plains, the slopes, and the passes. And above the water remained only the peaks that today are presented as the whole story. Imagine the Alps. Not a postcard for tourists, not white caps on the horizon, but a real mountain world. Mont Blanc, passes, gorges, forests, stone walls, icy slopes. Now imagine water slowly rising from below. First the valleys disappear, then the roads, then the forests, then the lower slopes, and finally only separate peaks remain on the surface. That is how New Zealand must be seen. not as two islands that randomly surfaced in the middle of the ocean. They are the summits of an ancient continent that ended up almost entirely below. What we see on the map is not all of Zealandia, but its cut-off silhouette above the water. This refers to the main deception of scale. The eye sees islands and thinks, a small country at the edge of the world. Geology shows something else. Beneath those islands lies the vast body of ancient land. The visible part is far too small to judge the true size. That is why the story of Zealandia sounds like an accusation against an overly simple world map. We were shown the summits and told they were islands. We were shown the remains and treated them as the whole. But under the water lay a continent that did not disappear from reality. It only disappeared from the ordinary human gaze. The strongest part of this story is not the water itself. The strongest part is how quickly people get used to an incomplete picture. If only a peak sticks out above the ocean, we calmly call it an island. But remove the water in your mind, and before you rises a vast, drowned country that the school map can no longer handle. And then the question becomes sharper. If Zealandia really was above water, if for tens of millions of years it carried its own nature, its own forms of life, and its own geological memory, what exactly went beneath the ocean with it? Only stone? Only ancient ridges? Or did a history sink with that continent? A history we still do not even know how to ask about properly. But Zealandia is not just a stone corpse beneath the ocean. This is where the most defiant part of the story begins. The continent went down, but life did not vanish with it. It clung to the peaks, to the forests, to the wet valleys, to the scraps of land that people would later call New Zealand. And there, something survived that would have been wiped out almost anywhere else on the planet by competition, predators, and time. Birds that forgot how to fly, reptiles that looked like living relics of an ancient Earth, plants that seemed to have been carried out of another age, not a museum behind glass, not a reconstruction in a textbook, a real living archive of a world that no longer exists. This refers to the strangest feature of Zealandia. Isolation here was not a pretty word. It was both a sentence and a shield. Australia was far away. Other continents were even farther. For millions of years, this land cooked in its own biological cauldron, almost untouched from the outside. On islands like these, nature behaves differently. Where there are no familiar land predators, birds begin to take over roles that belong to other creatures elsewhere. They become giant grazers, night wanderers, forest rulers, creatures that would never have lasted on an ordinary continent. New Zealand became a laboratory nobody built, but the planet itself kept locked for tens of millions of years. The tuatara is one of the harshest symbols of that locked laboratory. At first glance, it looks like a lizard, but that is deceptive. In reality, it belongs to an ancient reptile line whose relatives were already on Earth around 200 million years ago. While continents split apart, dinosaurs left the living world. Climates changed, oceans rose and retreated. This strange reptile continued to exist like a living accusation against short human memory. This refers not to exotic decoration for tourist brochures. It refers to the question of what an isolated land can actually preserve. If one edge of the planet could hold such ancient life forms, what else could it have held? What lines, what traces, what forgotten stories may have lasted there longer than the convenient textbook scheme allows? Zealandia created a world where birds became the main actors. There was no familiar pressure from mammalian land predators. No wolves, lions, tigers, or bears ran through these forests. The forests belonged to wings, beaks, claws, and strange creatures that would have looked impossible anywhere else. That is how the giant moa appeared. Enormous flightless birds that could reach 3.6 meters in height and weigh up to 230 kilograms. Imagine a bird taller than a person, heavier than a grown wild boar, without wings, but with powerful legs and the ancient confidence of a landowner. Does that sound like ordinary island wildlife? No, it sounds like a fragment of another world. This refers to that biological time capsule. While on the continents, one species pushed out another, while predators crushed the weak, while humans slowly reshaped landscapes, New Zealand remained a separate stage. Evolution was not writing the common book there. It was writing a closed volume that nobody opened for far too long. But this living museum also had a dark side. A world without familiar land predators was not a world without danger. The threat simply did not come from the bushes or from the ground. It came from above. And that is why the story of Zealandia does not end with charming birds, ancient reptiles, and rare plants. Above this isolated world once circled a true ruler of the air. Not a symbol, not a fairy tale creature, not an ornament from a legend. A real predator created by the same closed ecosystem. Haast's eagle, the bird that turned the sky into a territory of fear. This refers to the main transition from science to mystery. At first, Zealandia seems like a geological discovery. Then it becomes a biological miracle. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. This is not merely a drowned continent. It is a place where nature preserved too much that was strange, too much that was ancient, and too much that is inconvenient. And if on the visible peaks of Zealandia there survived tuataras, moa, rare plants and legends of a sky predator, then what may have remained in the invisible part of this world? What went beneath the water, together with the plains, forests and valleys? And why does every new fact about New Zealand sound less like a calm correction and more like another crack in the familiar picture of the past? But there is another splinter in this story, and it is not easy to pull out. If Zealandia was only a deep geological secret, then why do old maps suddenly show southern lands that look too much like a hint? Not satellite accuracy, not a modern map of the ocean floor, of course, but strange outlines, old labels, suspicious shapes, all the things the official version usually calls mistakes, coincidences, or the imagination of a mapmaker. The 15th and 16th centuries, Europe was still learning to see oceans not as the edge of the known world, but as a road. Sailors returned with scraps of information. Cartographers stitched together rumors, notes, testimonies, borrowed routes, and stolen Portuguese charts. And somewhere in the south, a vast land began to appear, a land nobody was in a hurry to explain too directly. This refers to old maps where the southern lands do not look like simple decoration for an empty space. In 1542, the French cartographer Jean Rots placed a large southern land on his map and called it La Terre Australe. Formally, this is not proof of Zealandia. But the question remains, where did such outlines come from if the official story places the familiar turning point much later? Portuguese sailors, according to some versions, may have approached these regions as early as the 1520s. Not as heroes of a school parade, not as loud discoverers with trumpets and flags, but quietly, commercially, cautiously, with maps that were often protected like weapons. In the age of great voyages, a map was not a souvenir. A map was power, money, route, and advantage. And here the game of dates becomes unpleasant. If some European sailors really knew about southern lands before Cook, why does mass history so confidently begin the countdown with him? Why does everything before the official name seem to fall into fog? Does land appear only when the right man writes it down in the right journal? This refers not to the idea that Cook did nothing. James Cook, in 1769, did map New Zealand with a precision that became a turning point for Europe. But admitting that does not mean closing your eyes to everything that may have happened earlier. An official date is often convenient, not because it is truly the first, but because it is better documented. Before Cook, there was Abel Tasman, 1642. The Dutch navigator reached the shores of New Zealand, saw the land, encountered local people, lost 4 sailors and left. History records this episode, but almost treats it like a side note, as if the main event was still ahead, as if everything before Cook was only an unsuccessful rehearsal. And if you dig deeper, it gets even more interesting. Old maps of the southern seas were often a mixture of real information, guesses, rumors, and political interests. But that is exactly why they cannot simply be thrown away. Where a modern reader sees an error, sometimes there may be a trace of another route. Where the academic tone says, "not convincing," the newspaper question sounds harder. What if this is not a mistake, but a badly understood trace? This refers to the most dangerous conflict in this part of the story: the official date versus the older trace. The official date has documents, names, ships, and journals. The older trace has maps, hints, disputed outlines, and irritating coincidences. One looks reliable, the other refuses to let the subject close. Seen this way, New Zealand stops being just a remote land that Europe once discovered. It becomes a place around which foreign eyes had been circling for too long. Some saw the coast and left. Others may have heard about it through fragments of sea stories. Others drew southern masses as if they knew more than later generations were allowed to admit. And the loudest part of this story is not the map itself. The loudest part is the habit of history to begin at the convenient moment. Before that moment, there were voyages, legends, rumors, clashes, trade secrets, lost notes. But when the official version arrives, it stamps the page and says, "This is where real history begins. Everything else, step aside." This refers to Zealandia especially sharply. The continent lay underwater for millions of years. Its visible part was known to local peoples long before European records. European maps may have caught its shadow before full recognition. And then the school formula reduced everything to a neat sequence: islands, discovery, date, surname. But that formula is too poor for this land. Zealandia is not an object you can explain with one label on a map. It looks like a place where several histories are stacked on top of each other: geological, biological, maritime, colonial, and the one still spoken carefully, the history of who knew, saw, or lived here before the official line. That is why old maps matter not as a final verdict, but as a splinter. They do not prove everything at once. They do not hand us a ready answer, but they damage the smooth surface of the official picture. And sometimes, for a real investigation to begin, you do not need an answer. You need one stubborn question. Who first saw these shores? Who first drew them on a secret chart? Who decided that one date would become the main date, while other traces could be left to gather dust in the archives? And if even the maps of the southern seas carry such shadows, what then might the caves, bones, and legends of Zealandia itself be hiding? And after maps, dates, and loud scientific words, the whole story suddenly shrinks down to one cave. No more millions of square kilometers beneath the water, no more Gondwana, no more Tasman Sea, no more ancient crust. Just one narrow passage, cold stone, headlamps, ropes, and darkness holding an object that could ruin peaceful sleep for any skeptic. 1986. The South Island of New Zealand. Manuhei Cave. Cavers descend into a place where an ordinary person would not go without a serious reason. A narrow limestone shaft, damp air, the smell of moisture, and the feeling that the walls have been keeping something inside for far too long. This refers not to beautiful geology anymore, but to a real physical trace. Not a line on a map, not a hypothesis about a continent, not a debate between scientists in a hall. Here everything becomes rougher, darker, and more unpleasant. A human hand in the cave touches something hard, and what comes out of the darkness is not a stone. In front of them is the foot of a bird. Not a skeleton, not a fossil, not a dry little bone that can be neatly placed in a box and marked with a Latin name. A foot, with claws, with scaly skin, with tendons, with remnants of tissue, as if the cave itself had decided to preserve this fragment of an ancient world in defiance of time. That was the blow. The find did not look like an object from the distant past. It looked like part of a creature that had only recently been moving somewhere nearby. The claws were clear. The skin had not vanished. The shape had not collapsed. And all of it had been lying in darkness, in the ground, in silence, among stone and cold air. This refers to the moment when history stops being convenient. As long as the talk is about millions of years, a viewer can keep a safe distance. Too far away, too abstract, too scientific. But when a foot with claws enters the picture, antiquity suddenly gains shape, skin, and a disturbing closeness. The size of the find struck the nerves almost as hard as its preservation. A claw, about 18 centimeters. The foot, roughly 30 centimeters from heel to the tip of the toe. This was not the foot of a small forest bird. This was the weapon of a creature that once walked across these islands with the confidence of something that believed the land belonged to it. The find was brought to specialists, and then a name was spoken that pulled an entire vanished age out of the dark. Giant moa, an enormous flightless bird, one of those ancient rulers of New Zealand that no longer lives in the forests. Yet this foot looked as if the past had not fully gone away, but had simply been waiting inside the cave for someone to disturb it again. This refers to the main provocation of this scene. The cave preserved not a legend, but a material object. Not the retelling of an old man by a fire. Not a sailor's rumor. Not a doubtful contour on a map. In the hands of researchers was a piece of a real, vanished world, and it looked far too fresh for the age assigned to it. Radiocarbon analysis added an even colder shade to the story. The foot turned out to be between 3,000 and 3,400 years old. 3 millennia in a cave, and still skin, claws, tissue, form. How is that even possible? The answer seems to exist. A dry, stable environment, very little bacterial activity, nearly perfect conditions for natural preservation. But that does not make the find any less unsettling, because one thing is to understand the explanation. Another thing is to see the foot itself. On paper, everything sounds calm. Preservation, microclimate, reduced decay, cave conservation. But the eye sees something else. An ancient bird stretching its claws out of the dark, straight into our own time. This refers to the real power of Zealandia as an archive. Here, not only stones remember the past, caves keep bodies, shells, bones, tissue, traces of creatures that lived in a world without familiar predators and without humans. The land did not just preserve nature's documents, it left physical evidence that cannot be dismissed with one dry phrase. And that is why the cave becomes more dangerous than any map. A map may be wrong. A sailor may have confused one shore for another. A cartographer may have drawn a southern land from rumors. But a foot with skin and claws does not invent stories. It simply lies before a person and silently asks, if this survived, what else is waiting in the dark? After such a discovery, New Zealand no longer looks like an ordinary archipelago. It becomes a display window of an ancient world, where every layer of earth may deliver another blow to the familiar version. Yesterday it was a submerged continent. Today, the foot of a giant bird. Tomorrow, who knows what else may be lifted from caves where, for centuries, no one entered except dampness, stone, and darkness. And the most unpleasant part is that this foot does not close the story. It opens it. Because behind it comes the next question. What kind of bird was this? How did it live? Why did it grow so large? Who saw it last? And why does nature in New Zealand keep pulling such objects out of the past, after which the official picture begins to sound far too smooth? The foot from the cave brought onto the stage a creature beside which an ordinary bird looks almost ridiculous. It was the giant moa, one of the strangest and most disturbingly majestic life forms of New Zealand. Not a predator with teeth, not a beast from a night forest, but a wingless bird that turned its own height and weight into the main law of survival. Imagine an emu. Now make it taller, heavier, more powerful, and remove the wings completely. Not shorten them, not hide them under feathers, but erase them as an unnecessary detail. What stands before you is no longer a familiar bird, but a living tower on two legs, moving through the forest as if the earth itself had to make room for it. This refers to the giant moa, which could reach about 3.6 meters in height and weigh up to 230 kilograms. Numbers like these sound almost indecent for a bird. 3.5 meters of living mass, a neck rising above a human head, powerful legs, huge feet, and claws that the cave preserved as if it wanted to leave the world direct evidence. The moa had no wings at all. Not weak wings, not small wings, not reduced little traces hidden under feathers. None. Evolution did not keep a useless organ for beauty. In a world with almost no land predators, flight stopped being a necessary escape. Why rise into the air when the ground already belongs to you? And this is where New Zealand again breaks the usual picture. On an ordinary continent, a large flightless bird would quickly become prey. In Zealandia, everything was different. Here, birds took over roles that mammals had taken elsewhere. Forests, plains, and wet valleys lived under a separate rule. This refers to the isolation that created not just rare wildlife, but an upside-down world. Where antelopes grazed in Africa, moa walked in New Zealand. Where predators on other continents kept herbivores in fear, here a giant bird could exist for centuries without the same pressure. And the longer this isolation lasted, the stranger the nature of the islands became. But the cave foot struck not only through its size, it struck through its feeling of presence. Dried skin, scales, tendons, the shape of the toes, the hooks of the claws. All of it looked as if the bird had not vanished into the depth of centuries, but had simply stepped out of the frame for a few minutes. It had been here. It had walked on wet ground. Its tracks could once have remained in the soft soil of an ancient forest. That made the find almost offensively alive. Not a museum exhibit, not a neat bone behind glass, not a dry label on a plaque. A person was looking at a fragment of a body from a world without roads, without cities, without European maps, without schoolbook schemes, and without the familiar version of history. That world was older than our explanations. This refers to the very effect that cannot be captured by the phrase archaeological find. The foot of the moa is not just an object, it is a blow against the distance between past and present. Usually, antiquity feels safe because it has turned into dust. Here it kept skin, claws, and shape. The giant moa was not a single bird, but a whole line of vanished species. Different moa once walked across New Zealand, some larger, some smaller, some adapted to forests, others to more open spaces. But all of them belonged to one strange reality, a reality in which birds became land giants. And now the main question sounds harsher. If such a bird could live beside humans, if its bones are found in cooking sites, if its image survived in tradition, then this was not some distant dinosaur from a mute age. This was a creature that entered human memory. It was not fantasy. It was flesh, feathers, footsteps, and fear. This refers to the most dangerous closeness of this story. The moa did not disappear millions of years before humans. It met humans on these islands. And that meeting became a sentence for an isolated world that had lived too long without such an opponent. The bird was not ready for hunting, fire, traps, and the hunger of a new species. When you look at the foot of a moa, the most frightening thing is not its size. It is the thought that before us is not a monster, but a victim of a new age. Evolution gave this creature enormous height, powerful legs, and the calm confidence of a landowner, but it did not give it the most important thing: experience of meeting humans. And so the giant silhouette in the forests of Zealandia began to vanish from the living world. But the story does not become calmer here, because the moa had almost no enemies on the ground, yet it had one enemy above, one true ruler of the sky. One predator that looked at a bird weighing 200 kilograms not as a miracle of nature, but as prey. And if the moa itself seems unbelievable, then the creature that hunted it sounds like the nightmare of Zealandia. The arrival of humans on these islands became the blow for which the closed world of Zealandia was not prepared. Before that, the giant moa had walked through forests and open valleys like the rightful owner of the land. It did not expect traps. It did not know fire. It did not know canoes, spears, cooking pits, or the hunger of newcomers who carried a new order with them. Māori encountered moa while they were still living, not in legends, not in carvings, not in museum glass, but in the real forests of New Zealand. For them, the moa was not ancient history. It was food, material, bone, feather, survival. And here begins the crude conflict. Humans entered an isolated ecosystem, and the balance broke almost immediately. This refers not to blaming one people, but to brutal ecological arithmetic. When a species spends millions of years without serious pressure from humans, it does not have time to develop protection. The moa was huge, powerful, and resilient, but it was not ready for hunting that did not stop after one successful kill. Humans arrived not as a single predator, but as a system. Archaeology speaks more harshly here than any polished version of the past. Across New Zealand, researchers find cooking sites with moa bones. At settlement sites, there are skeletal fragments, cut marks, tools made from bone, hooks, and everyday objects. This was not a random encounter in the forest. This was the large-scale use of a giant bird that suddenly became part of the human economy. And the more evidence appears, the less room remains for a romantic picture. The moa did not vanish because its time had simply come. It found itself in a world that changed faster than the species could endure. Small populations, slow reproduction, no experience of humans, all of it formed one sentence without ceremony. This refers to the generations after Maori arrival. The archaeological traces show intensive hunting, while the giant birds had little margin for recovery. Within 200 or 300 years after humans appeared, all 9 species of moa had left the living world. For nature, this is a blink. For humans, it is only a few generations. That is why this story is so unpleasant. The enormous bird survived geological changes, isolation, and millions of years of unusual evolution, but it did not survive the encounter with the new masters of the islands. Its height did not save it. Its weight of up to 230 kilograms did not save it. Its powerful legs did not save it. Against fire, organization, hunting, and hunger, its old advantages suddenly became almost useless. But Maori did not only hunt the moa, they remembered it. That is the crucial detail. The bird entered tradition, stories, images, and the memory of places. That means it was too visible, too important, too deeply woven into the lives of the first settlers to fade from memory without leaving a mark. This refers to the moment when natural history becomes human history. The moa was not an abstract species in a scientific table. It was a creature people lived beside, tracked, cut up, used, feared losing, and perhaps understood too late as something irreplaceable. When the last silhouettes of such birds left the forests, an entire age of Zealandia ended with them. And still, the story did not close. Because if Maori really encountered living moa, then their traditions are not just old tales. They become an archive of observations. They may preserve memories of real meetings, real hunts, real places where the giant bird still walked on the ground while humans were already building settlements. Here comes the sharpest detail. Official science can date, classify, and argue over populations and timelines. But the living memory of a people often holds what paper history loses. Maori remembered the moa not because they read about it in a book. They remembered it because their ancestors lived beside this giant. This refers to the nature of such traditions. When a story is repeated for generations, it changes, gathers images, becomes sharper, brighter, sometimes more frightening. But inside it, a core of fact can remain. And if those stories preserve the image of a huge flightless bird, then we are not dealing with empty fantasy, but with the trace of a meeting between humans and a world that no longer exists. That is why the vanishing of the moa is not just a page of biology. It is the first great rupture in the history of New Zealand after the arrival of humans. Before it, the islands lived by the rules of birds. After it, humans began writing the rules. And the price of that transition was monstrous. A whole line of giant species left the living world in a period that nature barely counts as time. Zealandia again reveals its uncomfortable truth. When humans enter a closed world, they do not simply take a place inside nature. They change the system itself. They bring fire, hunger, memory, tools, and the ability to take more than an ecosystem can restore. And if the moa foot from the cave looks almost alive, it is not only a miracle of preservation, it is a silent accusation from time. Before us is not just a fragment of a bird, it is the trace of a world that met humans and quickly began to vanish from forests, cooking fires, and living reality, leaving behind bones, traditions, and one heavy question. How many such worlds were erased, not by catastrophe, but by the ordinary human habit of taking everything that could be taken? But the most uncomfortable part begins after the official full stop. On paper, everything looks neat. The moa vanished roughly 600 years ago after the arrival of humans, after hunting, after the old balance was broken. The date is set, the species is closed, the museum label is written. It would seem the page can be turned. But New Zealand does not like such smooth pages. In traditions, stories, and late testimonies, the image of a large, flightless bird appears again and again. Not an abstract monster from night fear, not a vague forest spirit, but a creature with recognizable features. Great height, powerful legs, heavy movement, and a life hidden in the remote regions of the South Island. This refers to the most dangerous question. Did the moa vanish exactly when we find it convenient to believe it did? Or could the last birds have survived in distant places longer than the strict scheme allows? There is no answer with an iron seal. But dismissing these accounts as empty chatter is also too easy. Maori remembered the moa not from books. They lived on a land where this bird had been part of the reality of their ancestors. Traditions preserved routes, places, descriptions, and certain details of behavior. And if the memory of a people kept returning to the image of a huge bird, then inside that memory there may have been not only myth, but a late trace of a real encounter. In some stories, mentions of similar creatures reach into the 16th century. That is no longer deep antiquity and not silent geology. That is the age when, in other parts of the world, books were being printed, empires were being built, sea expeditions were crossing oceans, and maps were being redrawn. And in the mountains and forests of New Zealand, according to these accounts, someone may still have been seeing the shadow of a disappearing giant. This refers not to proof, but to suspicion. And the suspicion here is sticky, stubborn, and unpleasant. The islands are large, the forests are thick, the mountain regions are difficult to reach, and a rare bird is not obliged to appear before people on schedule, especially if the last members of its kind were already on the edge of vanishing. In the 1840s, late reports appeared about encounters with a large flightless bird in remote areas. Later, in the 1870s, the zoologist George Gay gathered more than 100 Maori testimonies. The stories came from different places, from different people, yet the same features kept repeating. A large bird, mountainous areas, secrecy, and a similar appearance. And here the real newspaper splinter cuts in. More than 100 testimonies are too many to wave away with a lazy gesture. But no proof of a living bird was found. No fresh feather, no convincing track. No body that could be placed on a table before skeptics. And so the official version calmly pushed those accounts into the realm of legend. This refers to the eternal conflict between paper and memory. Paper demands an object. Memory preserves an image. Science asks, where is the specimen? Tradition answers, our elders saw it, our places remember, our stories did not grow out of nothing. And where exactly is the border between mistake, late legend, and the final echo of a vanished species? New Zealand only makes this question sharper. This is a country where caves can preserve a foot with skin and claws for 3,000 years. A country where moa eggs have been found with thick preserved shells. A country where dry darkness works like a natural safe. After such finds, the phrase, "that could not have happened," sounds far too self-confident. Maybe the last stories about the moa really were mistakes. Maybe people confused some other creature with the ancient bird. Maybe tradition mixed memory, fear, and mountain silence. But there is another possibility. The final members of the species survived longer than it is convenient to admit, and then left the living world without a loud date, without witnesses holding cameras, without a neat ending. This refers to the very nature of disappearance. Species rarely leave the world in the way textbooks prefer. There is no solemn final scene. There is no sign on a tree saying, "the last one was here." First, the bird is seen often, then rarely, then only in distant places, then only stories remain, then people laugh at the stories, and years later, it sometimes turns out that the laughter came too soon. That is why the memory of the moa matters so much. It stands between science and legend, between cooking sites and caves, between the official date and the voices that did not fit neatly into a strict report. It does not prove a sensation, but it does not allow the question to be closed with one dry sentence either. And if the enormous moa really did linger in remote regions longer than accepted, that changes not only the timeline, it changes the whole feeling of the story. It means the ancient world of Zealandia did not break off all at once. It retreated slowly into forests, mountains, mist, and the stories of elders, until only a foot in a cave remained. And one troubling question: who saw the last moa, and why was that person not believed? And here the story of Zealandia suddenly steps out of the world of birds, caves, and maps, because the harshest question no longer concerns geology or vanished animals. It concerns people. Who was the first to step onto these shores? Who lived here before those now commonly regarded as the first people of New Zealand? And why does this question still sound as if it should be asked in a lower voice? The official picture looks tidy. New Zealand was settled late, much later than many other parts of the planet. The ancestors of the Māori came from Polynesia, entered the islands, faced the world of moa, forests, mountains, and unknown dangers. Everything seems clear enough. They arrived, settled, built a culture, preserved traditions, left settlements, and left traces in the ground. This refers to the familiar version that is easy to retell in a textbook. But that version has a dangerous shadow. In Maori traditions, there are mentions of those who may have been here earlier. not necessarily a great civilization with stone cities and lost temples. Perhaps small groups of people, early waves, traces too faint to fit comfortably into the official scheme. This is where the nerve of the entire alternative line begins. Some traditions do not only say, "We came." In certain retellings, something else is heard. Others were already here. People who knew the islands, the forests, the coasts, the mountain passages. People whose names reached us in disputed forms, whose images became mixed with memory, myth, and later interpretations. This refers not to a proven verdict, but to an uncomfortable question. Were there other settlers before the ancestors of the Maori? Was there an earlier Polynesian wave that was later absorbed by new arrivals? Or are we dealing with later legendary images that formed within the tradition itself? There is no simple answer, and that is exactly why the subject is so dangerous for a smooth narrative. Some traditions mention peoples or groups who supposedly lived on the islands before the arrival of the main Maori ancestors. In later interpretations, names such as Māori and other variants of ancient inhabitants appear. Where is memory here? Where is political myth? Where is a translator's mistake? Where is the real trace of an earlier migration? The question does not close with one casual gesture. Official science is cautious, and there is logic in that. A loud claim requires more than stories. It requires dating, settlements, bones, tools, and a clear chain of evidence. But traditions do not appear out of nothing either, especially among peoples where memory was not entertainment, but knowledge, carried through guardians, kin lines, place names, roots, and stories tied to specific land. This refers to the most important detail. Oral tradition can make mistakes in dates, merge images, and turn real people into almost mythical figures. But it can preserve the core of an event longer than a paper archive, especially where written chronicles did not exist, and the land spoke through names, prohibitions, genealogies, and fireside accounts. If an earlier group really existed before the Maori, it may have been small, not an empire, not a lost race from a cheap novel. A few settlements, a few kin groups, a few canoes that arrived before the main wave. They could have dissolved, been displaced, entered other groups, and left weak traces in language, traditions, and place names. And in that form, the version becomes not fantastic, but far more unpleasant. History loves large events, the arrival of a people, the name of a leader, an exact date, a beautiful beginning. Real life often begins in a dirtier, blurrier, unofficial way. First, someone arrives, then others arrive, then the first traces are worn away. Centuries later, descendants argue over whether it happened at all. This refers to New Zealand especially sharply. The islands have long been considered among the last major landmasses settled by humans. That idea is convenient. Edge of the world, late arrival, clean chronology. But allow even one earlier wave and the smooth scheme begins to crack. Not collapse entirely, but it no longer looks so self-satisfied. Traditions about those who came before do not give a ready answer. They only open a door. Behind that door may be an ordinary early Polynesian migration. There may be a chain of mistakes and later reinterpretations. Or there may be a small, almost erased human story that was missed because it left no loud palaces, no great walls, and no convenient inscription carved in stone. That is what makes the question so powerful. There is no need to shout about a lost civilization for the story to become unsettling. It is enough to ask, who was truly first? Who saw these forests before the known Maori ancestors? Who heard the call of the moa before large settlements? Who looked at the peaks of Zealandia before the official chronology took its familiar shape? Here, Zealandia again behaves like an archive that refuses to hand over answers all at once. It shows fragments, a foot in a cave, bones in cooking sites, old maps, traditions about earlier people. Each fragment can be disputed on its own, but together they create a heavy feeling. The history of this land may be older and more complex than the short reference version suggests. And if New Zealand really is the summit of a drowned continent, if its nature lived separately for millions of years, if its caves preserved the traces of ancient creatures, then why should human history here be simple? Why should everything begin strictly with a convenient date? Why could a land that hid an entire continent not also hide a few first human traces? That is the real provocation. Not to declare every legend a fact, but to refuse to let the official scheme silence an inconvenient question. Traditions say, others may have been here before us. Disputed versions pick up that thought. Science demands evidence, and Zealandia, as always, remains silent, and by that silence only deepens the suspicion. But traditions alone are not enough for a subject this dangerous. A tradition may preserve memory, but it does not deliver a verdict. And this is where heavier things begin to appear on the table. Remains, strange images cut into rock, disputed dates, old reports from researchers, and those inconvenient details that the official picture prefers to keep at a safe distance. In 1996, in the area of the Waitaha Peninsula on the South Island, according to disputed reports, human remains were found that some authors connected with an earlier human presence. Dates around the 10th century AD were mentioned, and if such a dating is correct, it strikes directly at the heart of the familiar scheme. Who, then, was on these islands before the main wave of Maori settlement? This refers to the zone where history becomes especially nervous. On one side, hard evidence is needed. Laboratories, repeated analyses, a clear archaeological layer, independent checks. On the other, the very possibility of early finds already turns the calm chronology into a minefield, because one inconvenient layer can ruin an entire beautiful construction. Around such remains, a battle of interpretations always begins. Some say, a dating error, a disturbed layer, a wrong description, later confusion. Others ask, then why has the question not been closed completely? Why do reports keep surfacing about features that supposedly do not fit the familiar Polynesian profile? Why is every inconvenient deviation so quickly declared noise? There is no need to make a cheap jump here and shout about a lost civilization. That would be too easy and too weak. The stronger version is different. Before us are clues without a verdict. They do not prove a sensation, but they do not allow a calm full stop either. And for a land like Zealandia, sometimes the absence of a full stop sounds louder than a ready answer. This refers also to petroglyphs, images carved into rock found in different parts of New Zealand. Some are explained within Maori tradition, some are linked to later traces, and some remain disputed. But the most inconvenient images do not look exactly as one expects from familiar patterns. They are simpler, more geometric, rougher, as if they came from another layer of memory. Lines, figures, signs, silhouettes remain on the stone. The stone does not explain itself. It does not sign the author's name. It does not say, "I was made then by those people." That is why every such drawing becomes a battlefield. For one person, it is an ordinary local trace. For another, a hint of an older hand. For a third, a mistake that should not be inflated at all. And then comes a name that the academic world did not pronounce with much delight: Barry Fell. In the 1970s and 1980s, he put forward sharp claims about ancient inscriptions and possible traces of foreign writing systems. He tried to connect some petroglyphs and signs with Ogham, an ancient Irish script. Does that sound bold? Yes. Does it sound too bold? Also yes. This refers to the slipperiest point in the entire line. Academic science mostly rejected Fell's conclusions as insufficiently grounded. and there is no reason to pretend that the dispute carried equal weight on both sides. No, most specialists did not accept his readings. But the stones themselves did not disappear. The images remained. The questions remained. The irritation around the subject remained too. Why does this story grip so tightly? Because it shows an old habit of official memory. When an interpretation is disputed, people often try to bury the object of discussion along with it. But the object has not gone anywhere. The rock still stands. The lines are still on it. Local traditions exist. Early reports remain. And all of this forms not a proof, but an uneasy background. This refers to the difference between proven and inconvenient. Proven is when you can stamp the page. Inconvenient is when there is no stamp, but the question still sticks out of the ground like a stone. Zealandia is full of such stones. Each one can be walked around separately, but when there are too many of them, the road no longer looks straight. Remains that some connect with an early period, petroglyphs that not everyone is ready to fit confidently into the usual scheme, traditions about earlier people, old maps of southern lands, the foot of a moa, preserved as if the past refuses to turn into dust. All of this is not one great proof. It is a scattering of fragments that makes the official picture less smooth. And the main question here is not whether Barry Fell was right about everything. Most likely he was not. Too many weak points, too many bold readings, too many stretches. But a poor interpretation does not erase the existence of the finds themselves. And if a disputed researcher was wrong in his answer, that does not mean the question itself was empty. New Zealand again forces the eye to look more closely, not at loud slogans, but at small traces, not at a pretty legend, but at a strange coincidence. Traditions speak of earlier people, disputed finds feed the argument, stones keep unclear signs, and the official scheme keeps asking everyone not to get distracted and move on. But why move on if the question is lying right underfoot? Who carved these signs? Who left the first traces? Why is part of the evidence so easily dismissed as error, without fully explaining where the persistence of these stories came from? And why, on a land that has already hidden an entire continent from us, should human history be simple, flat, and free of cracks? And now, Zealandia stops being only a mystery underwater. It shows its claws. Because above the world where moa walked across the land like living towers, there hung the shadow of a creature that turned the sky itself into a hunting trap. Haast's eagle. The largest eagle known to science, not a beautiful bird from a coat of arms, not a proud symbol on a flag, not a graceful predator from a nature documentary. This was a flying strike, shaped by island evolution for one purpose: to fall from above and break its prey before the prey even understood where the danger came from. This refers to the central nightmare of isolated Zealandia. On the ground, the moa had almost no enemies, but above the forests, there was a ruler that needed no fangs, no pack, and no long chase. It needed height, speed, claws, and the precision of an attack from the sky. The wingspan of Haast's eagle reached roughly 2.6 to 3 meters. By wingspan alone, it did not look impossible beside today's large birds. But its weight, that is where nature became almost scandalous. Females could weigh up to 15 kilograms, and by some estimates, even more. For an eagle, that is a monstrous mass, almost an insult to the usual idea of what a bird should be. And still it flew, not like a light shadow over a plain, not like a lazy scavenger circling while waiting for someone else's meal. Haast's eagle was an active hunter. It did not wait for nature to leave leftovers. It chose the target itself, struck from above itself, and turned the giant moa into prey itself. This refers to the detail that makes the whole story almost brutally direct. The claws of Haast's eagle have been compared to the claws of a large predator like a tiger. Up to 9 centimeters along the curve. Not decoration, not a tool for holding a branch, but real weaponry. Such a claw could enter the body of prey, lock into it, and crush resistance with one terrible pull. Imagine not a bird, but a tiger with wings. Only a tiger runs across the ground, while this predator came down from the sky. No warning, no roar, no dry branches cracking underfoot. First, there is silence above the forest, then a shadow, a strike, the crack of bone. And the enormous moa is no longer the owner of the land, but food for the one who ruled from above. The attack speed could reach around 80 kilometers per hour. This was not a slow descent and not a beautiful hunting curve. It was a vertical strike from cover, from the tree canopy, from a blind zone where the prey had no time to look. A moa weighing close to 200 kilograms could be struck in the pelvis, back or neck, and drop where, a second earlier, it had still been walking. This refers not to an artist's fantasy, but to biomechanics. Haast's eagle did not need to carry the moa away whole. It did not need to lift such a mass into the air. Its task was simpler and more frightening. Drop down, disable the prey, and then use what Zealandia had given it. Powerful legs, hooked claws, a tearing beak, and total control of the upper layer of the forest. Why did it become like this? Because New Zealand itself made it this way. In a world where the main large prey was moa, an ordinary eagle would not have been enough. Evolution began turning the predator into a weapon built for a specific target. Its ancestor was likely much smaller, closer to eagles from Australia, but through long isolation, it became the airborne executioner of giant birds. And here the ruthless logic of Zealandia appears again. The moa grew large because the land was safe. The eagle grew terrifying because large moa became its food. One giant created another. One imbalance in nature produced the next. That is how a closed ecosystem created not a charming oddity, but a real arms race of size and force. This refers to the dark beauty of this story. Zealandia was not a paradise. It was a separate world with its own laws, where birds took the roles of beasts, and the sky became the place of greatest danger. When humans entered these islands, they did not enter an empty museum of nature. They entered an arena where a predator already existed that could attack something larger than an adult person. And here comes the question that makes the skin tighten. If Haast's eagle could strike moa weighing hundreds of kilograms, what was a human to it? 160 to 170 centimeters tall, 60 to 80 kilograms in weight, without armor, without the habit of looking upward every second. For a predator used to attacking giant birds, such a target did not look impossible. Māori traditions preserved the image of a great bird known as Pouākai or Pouākai. It was described as a creature with enormous claws, capable of attacking people and carrying off children. It would be too convenient to dismiss this as a fairy tale, but when the bones of Haast's eagle exist beside it, when its size, speed, and hunting mechanics are clear, the legend no longer sounds like invention. It begins to sound like memory that survived fear. This refers to one of those rare cases where myth and science do not fight, but look in the same direction. Science shows a giant eagle. Tradition speaks of a feared bird. The earth gives bones. Oral memory gives a name, and between them appears that cold gap where history stops being calm. Haast's eagle was not merely an animal, it was the peak of the food chain, the final word of isolated evolution in Zealandia. For millions of years, nature assembled this mechanism. Enormous prey on the ground, a crushing strike from the air, the forest as cover, the sky as a weapon. Then humans entered the system, and everything began to break. The vanishing of the moa knocked away the eagle's main food source. When the giant birds left the forests, the aerial predator lost the foundation of its world. It was too specialized, too perfectly shaped for one ecosystem, too well built for a past that suddenly ended. And that was its tragedy. A perfect weapon became useless when the target disappeared. That is why Haast's eagle is not just a terrifying detail for a dramatic picture. It is a symbol of Zealandia, a continent underwater, birds without wings, giants in the forests, a predator in the sky. Everything here is too large, too ancient, too inconvenient for a simple schoolbook scheme. If the moa was the living tower of a vanished world, then Haast's eagle was its black lightning. Pouākai. This is the name that turns dry paleontology into the uneasy memory of a people. In Maori tradition, this bird is not a harmless forest spirit. It appears as a huge winged predator, a creature that could attack people, carry off children, and appear where no ordinary bird should inspire such fear. It would be too convenient to call it a fairy tale and close the page. But beside that name lie the bones of Haast's eagle, and this is where legend stops being only legend. Science says such a bird really existed. It was enormous, powerful, armed with terrifying claws, and it lived in the same forests where the first people entered the islands. Tradition says people feared a great bird from the sky. This refers to one of those rare cases where myth and bone look in the same direction. One source gives a name, the other gives a skeleton. One preserves fear, the other explains the mechanism of that fear. Wingspan, weight, claws, attack from above, and prey larger than a human being. Pouākai may not have been pure invention. It may have been the late echo of a real predator. Not a scientific description with a ruler and a date. Not a witness report written in ink, but a people's memory of something that truly circled above New Zealand's forests. When a creature is capable of attacking moa weighing up to 200 kilograms, human fear no longer sounds like superstition. It sounds like common sense. For perhaps 2 centuries, humans and the eagle may have shared the same island world. People entered the forests, hunted, made fire, built settlements, and searched for food. Above them remained a predator that had never known humans before and had no reason to understand that a new master of the land had arrived. To the eagle, a human may not have looked like a mystery. It may have looked like moving prey. This refers to the harsh collision of 2 eras. On one side stood the ancient ecosystem of Zealandia, tuned to moa, forests, and a sky predator. On the other stood humans, carrying fire, tools, memory, hunger, and the ability to change an environment faster than nature could answer. A meeting like that could not end quietly. When the moa vanished, Haast's eagle lost the foundation of its world. Its body, claws, strike, and entire logic of survival had been shaped around giant prey. Remove the moa, and the throne of the sky begins to collapse. The perfect hunter suddenly finds itself built for a world that no longer exists. Humans likely added pressure too. A dangerous predator near settlements could hardly be ignored. Its feathers, bones, and eggs may have carried value. Its presence could not have been treated calmly if stories of Pouākai preserved real fear. The bird was no longer merely part of nature. It became a threat inside a changing human landscape. This refers not to a heroic victory over a monster, but to a cold ecological ending. First, the moa population was pushed down. Then the eagle's main food base disappeared. Then the predator, designed for the old world, no longer fit the new one. And by around 1400, Haast's eagle had left the living world. There was no grand final scene. No one wrote down, "Here was the last eagle." No witness stood under the final shadow with a date and a signature. One day, the skies of Zealandia simply changed. The black strike from above stopped coming. The feared bird moved from living reality into tradition. And here the whole story ties itself into one dark knot. The eighth continent lay underwater until it was allowed a name. The foot of a giant moa rested in a cave for 3,000 years and looked almost alive. Tradition spoke of people who may have come before the known beginning. Rocks held disputed signs, and above all of it flew Pouākai, part myth, part memory, part warning from a world that refused to disappear cleanly. This refers to the main meaning of Zealandia. It does not give the past in a convenient form, it gives it in fragments: stone, map, claw, bone, legend, disturbing name. Each fragment can be challenged on its own, but together they form a picture too large for the usual schoolbook frame. New Zealand is not merely the edge of the world, it is the visible peak of a drowned and unfinished history. Beneath it lies a continent. In its caves lie traces of vanished giants. In its traditions live birds that may have been more frightening than any beast. In its disputed finds remains the question of who may have come before. And here is the final blow. Perhaps the most important things are not hidden only underwater. They are hidden in the way we have been trained to look at the past. We are given a clean map, a neat date, an official name, and a short explanation. Then the earth pulls a clawed foot out of the darkness, and that neatness begins to crack. What else lies beneath the ocean? What else is sealed in caves? Which names survived only in tradition because no official record was written in time? And if one continent could remain almost hidden in plain sight, who said the same cannot be true of other buried chapters of the planet? Zealandia does not ask for blind belief. It simply shows that history is wider, deeper, and more dangerous than a school map. It preserves what did not enter the textbook, what did not fit the official line, what was treated as secondary for far too long. The question is no longer only what is hidden beneath Zealandia. The question is what else is hidden, where it is hidden, and who will dare to look there without the comfortable blindfold. Subscribe if you want to see not the polished postcard of the past, but its dark edges. Here we go where the map falls silent, where bones argue with textbooks, and where traditions suddenly grow claws. The next story may be even more inconvenient. And if this story made you question the familiar map of the world, even for a second, then Zealandia has already done its work. Hit the like button if you want more investigations like this. Not smooth, not schoolbook safe, not comfortable, but the kind where the ground, the water, and old traditions begin to reveal a completely different shape of the past. Subscribe to the channel because the stories ahead will be even darker, stranger, and more inconvenient. And make sure to press the bell icon so you do not miss the next episode. Because as Zealandia shows us, the most important things are often not on the surface. They are waiting where most people do not even dare to look.